Hello everyone, welcome back to Jazz Arranging class. I'm going to today go over a four horn and rhythm chart, a jazz combo chart I did on My Romance. It's kind of an anatomy of a typical combo chart that I would put together. And it's concepts and techniques that you can use when arranging for small jazz groups. And what I'll do is I'll take specific parts of the chart and then I'll play them for you. I'll go over aspects of the melody, voice leading, arranges, the introduction, all those kinds of things, the ending, and so on and so forth. So as we go through here, I'll play each one after I describe what I did in that particular section. At the very end, I'll play the whole chart for you. So let's get started. First thing I'll typically do is start with an introduction. And this introduction, I chose 8 bars. So eight bars generally is a good introduction. Sometimes I've written 45 bar introductions for big band charts and things like that, but you never know. Usually 8 bars or 4 bars works pretty well. So the technique I used in the introduction is a pedal point, and a pedal point is moving harmony over a static bass note, which usually is the 5. So this is the key of C, so we have a static bass note for note G, and that moves over 2 bar phrases. And what I wanted to do was alternate between dissonance and consonance. So there's kind of a tension and release for 2 bar phrases. Now, when you come up with something like this, usually what I do is find the notes and the sound I want, the tension and the release, and then I figure out what the chord change is. So I can write those in for the guitar player or the piano player, but in this case I wrote out the piano part, so they have to play it exactly as written, and the bass player as well. Drummer just kind of goes along with what they're already playing. So let me play this for you. Okay, let's take a look at the most important thing I think when dealing with an arrangement is how you treat the melody. I'm going to go over the ways that I use the melody and how I mixed it up throughout the arrangement, and then I'll play the examples for you in just a minute. First thing is unison. In a 4-horn setup, you can have 1 to 4 players playing the same thing, which is the melody, in unison. In my case, I did 2 players playing the melody at some points, and I also had just 1 player playing, and that is melody and accompaniment. So I would have the trumpet player playing the melody, and the other horn players were doing kind of an accompaniment with harmony and rhythm. The other thing you can do is harmonizing the melody throughout the entire 4 horns in rhythmic unison. So this would be like just harmonizing it straight down and chords and moving in rhythmic unison. One thing I have to say that you'll need to do is use rhythmic variation. When you pull out a stock lead sheet out of any book, pretty much, you're going to see very lame rhythms. You're going to see very straight ahead rhythms and nothing very interesting. So one thing you want to do, you don't want to change the melody, but you do want to add some rhythmic variety. And you can do that with anticipations. Anticipations are basically moving the melody up on the and of 2 and the and of 4. And you'll see that when you listen to this arrangement. So by varying all of the above, you'll use the melody's phrases as a guide. And if you can vary them and make them interesting to the listener, that's what you really want to have as a goal. So let's get started and listen to some of this stuff. Here's an example of where I used 2-horn weight with some rhythmic variation, and it's in unison. The next one is how I use the trumpet as the melody with the other horns accompanying him or her. The trumpet is in a pretty good range. Sometimes it gets a little low, so I need to move the alto player to jump in. And once he gets up in the staff, it's okay. This works as long as the trumpet is a little louder, so the dynamics should reflect how you want this to sound. That the accompaniment should be a little less, the melody should be up on top. So let's listen to this one. The next example is four-part harmony with all the horns. So this is something that works well when you have a little climactic and you want the melody to have some harmony below. So obviously the trumpet player is still playing the melody on top. The other horn players are playing rhythmic unison along with harmony. It's all voiced out. And you'll notice that the first few pickup notes I doubled in unison, so that because the trumpet player is pretty low, the alto player gives them a little reinforcement until they break out into harmony in that second bar. So let's take a listen. Okay, you've probably noticed by now that I've used anticipations throughout the chart. Not always, but for the most part, probably 75%. And that's moving that melody onto the and of 2 and 4. So you don't add more notes in the melody. You can't change the actual melody, just vary the rhythm. So not to beat a dead horse here, but I want to give an example of this tune that I found in a book of lead sheets. And this is typical. Most lead sheets will be dull and they'll be bland rhythmically. They just lay out a very basic melody. So it's really important to vary that rhythm using the ands of 2s, the 4s, and also, where you see fit, just using different rhythmic variations so you can make it more interesting. Don't use the straight stock lead sheet. It's boring. Okay, moving on to voice leading. Voice leading is how you basically move the voices of the horn players around each other and throughout the arrangement. So the first thing I would recommend is stepwise movement is the best. Small leaps are second best. The more idiomatic and the more easy you can make it for the players to play, the better. And that goes for any arrangement. Always look for inner voice movement opportunities. I always do this, and even when I harmonize a tune, I will always come up with new chords by moving inner voices around onto alternate notes and so on and so forth. And you can see that sometimes I'll move from a sharp 11 to the 5th and so on. You'll see that throughout this arrangement as well. Avoid doubling notes in the horns if you can. We only have 4 horn players here, so you cannot double unless you're doing maybe a coupling of two notes or whatever. Obviously unison is doubling for a perfect reason, but avoid doubling notes in harmonic situations. So you wouldn't double the 3rd or 5th or whatever in a harmonic situation where you're harmonizing all the way down. You want to have 4 different chord tones in those voicings when you write out those horn players. Avoid the root of the chord in the voicings, unless it's the melody, of course. But the root in the chord really has no meaning because the bass player is going to be covering that, the piano player is going to be laying down voicings and so on and so forth. So you don't need the root. Get rid of it. Use chordal voicings when possible to add fullness. And this isn't always possible. Sometimes you'll come across, obviously in a dominant 7th chord, you can't have, because you have the tritone, you can't have chordal, but any kind of major, like major 9 voicing or major 13, minor chords can have chordal voicings as well. So look for those opportunities when you can. As the lead line gets higher, open up your chord voicings. So you're going to have more of a spread between, as that trumpet player gets up in the staff, try not to go too high because it'll get out of kilter, but you're going to have to open up your chord voicings. When you have the trumpet player lower, you can have closed voicings, but as they get higher, you're going to have to open those up. So let me play an example of this one. Okay, I wanted to use this example one more time to just show you the voice leading. So when you write idiomatic voice leading, that means really easy for the player to play. It really helps the music sound smooth, and it helps the overall sound of everything. Right over here, at the end here, as the lead line goes higher, the voicings should be spread out. So you'll listen to that. Don't get that trombone player and tenor player too high. It'll just sound too out of whack. So let's listen. Okay, next topic to cover is how you treat solos. Typically in a jazz combo or really any jazz arrangement up to big band or whatever, you'll have some kind of solos. And that'll be one person, playing over the chord changes, improvising. In a combo setting, you'll probably have more than, say, a larger group, just because it's a smaller setting. Traditionally, back in the early days, three horn or two horn groups had lots of solos. They just play the melody and then play a solo. But in arrangement, what I like to do is after playing the head of the tune or the whole form of the tune, I like to give a little introduction to the solo section. You'll see how that works in just a minute. But it's something to think about. Solo breaks can also be used just as effectively, though. Like, the band or the combo comes to a stop and the horn player jumps in for a measure or two before the actual form starts on the solo. So those solo breaks can work well. With combos, those solos can be open, and you can let guys play a solo, have the next guy play a solo. You can also have the horn player playing a solo and then have backgrounds written in. So in that case, you may not have an open section. You would just have one soloist written, and then the others play the background. So it depends on the tune, really. But let's take a listen to that. Next topic to consider is key changes. Will you do a key change in your arrangement? Well, I chose to do one. And I don't always do that, but I did choose to move this chart up a half step for the last 16 bars. So when you choose a key, always keep the ranges of the horns in mind. And it's best to move up a half step or a minor third or something like that. If you move up a major seventh or something like that, it's going to be a little weird. So keep those modulations typically within a minor third or a third of each of the original key, and you'll be safe. So avoid modulating up a fourth or a fifth, especially because a fourth or a fifth, actually the fourth inverted is a fifth and vice versa. So you don't get really the effect of a good key change unless there's some real, the listener can really hear that there was a key change. A well-chosen key change provides interest for both the players and the listeners alike. The players have to think a little more at the end or in the middle of the chart when the keys change. I've seen Rob McConnell charts where the key changes like every chorus, so you never know. But avoid modulations also that have like 7 sharps in some of the horns or 7 flats for any player. I remember I did an arrangement in high school for our pep band, and it was something from, I believe, one of the Broadway shows at the time, and it was in the key of B flat, and I modulated to the key of B major, which put the trumpets in 7 sharps. So our trumpet players were not very good in high school, and they could not handle 7 sharps. So be careful, unless you're writing for pros maybe, don't use 7 sharps or 7 flats in your modulation. So let's take a listen to the modulation that I did in this one. Okay, last but certainly not least is the ending. Endings, I found, are getting more and more difficult, it seems. But in this particular chart, I implemented a turnaround using suspended chords. A lot of times in a combo chart, you can use turnarounds, and all they are is kind of a progression that repeats a couple times. Typically, a turnaround is a 1, 6, 2, 5, 7, 1 progression repeated a couple times, and then you end. But in this case, I use suspended chords kind of as my turnaround. A flat 13 sus for 2 bars, moving up a half step to A 13 sus, back to A flat 13 sus for 2 bars, and then I ended with kind of a tritone sub, E flat minor 9 to D major 9 to D flat major 13. So now we're in D flat major, not C any longer, so obviously that's the tonic. And then I did a little thing in the trumpet that I didn't even realize that I did, but it just kind of came to me at the end, and it is actually, I stole that from Igor Stravinsky. If you'll notice, it's from the bassoon solo at the beginning of the Rite of Spring. So you never know where this stuff's going to come from, but that's the ending that I used. Obviously, you can do anything in the ending, but in a combo chart, as I mentioned, typically turnarounds kind of work well because that's typically how they ended back in the day when they had a lot of combos playing in the bebop era and so on. They would do little turnarounds and end the chart that way. So let's take a listen to my ending. Okay, so that about wraps up my arrangement, the anatomy of a combo chart written on the tune My Romance. So I appreciate you hanging in there until this point. I did want to give you some context and play the entire chart. I'll skip the solo section, obviously, but this way you can see how the whole thing fits together. So let's take a listen, and thanks again.